Okay, well, our group was the speech group, and so we talked about speech. Speech technologies of all kinds, mostly speech recognition, but we spent quite a bit of time talking as well about text-to-speech synthesis, and just touched briefly on other issues, primarily around corpora that are used for training speech and the difficulties, the many of the applications that are of interest to the group can't really benefit from very large-scale corpus collection and management, and there were questions that revolved around is it possible for us to build smaller footprint applications with fewer samples of speech, and if so, how might that work? We opened up with a discussion about why speech technology has moved essentially from the local computer platform into the cloud. Almost all of the speech applications today involve distributed processing in which the recognizer and the grammars and especially in voice XML systems, the speech databases, all reside offline away from the computer. And that really limits certain kinds of applications that either can't get access to the web or have intermittent access to the web, or that just need to be able to run the apps locally. And of course, the reason speech technologies are that way is because resource management is at a premium, and it's much easier to take advantage of the vast resources out in the cloud rather than locally. But we concluded that really this is as much a business problem as any other problem, and that at the end of the day, the forces that are in play are the ones that we have to live with when we're trying to build applications. Latencies was a big issue as well. Some applications, in fact almost all speech applications, can't afford significant latencies because it throws off all of the basic rhythms, the timings associated with prosody and turn-taking and other elements of the speech interface. And that problem is exacerbated when we have distributed processes in the cloud. Multimodal corpora, we discussed very briefly. They're just almost impossible to acquire and manage, and that constrains our abilities to deal with applications in multimodal contexts. But then we sort of began to wax philosophical about some of the issues that have been raised in Roger and my talk about ethical issues, and especially about the disconnect between our interest in the basic research of speech technology as in terms of how it is an innately human activity and built directly into the biology of the human being, and yet the systems that we currently are enjoying commercial success with are in fact completely disconnected from any kind of cognitive or brain research or biological research. It's kind of unfortunate that that's the case, but we're searching for an alternative curve, as Roger described, the curve that asymptotes well short of where we want to be in terms of accuracy. And so we wondered a bit about how we might be able to modify our research efforts in order to take better advantage of the kinds of information that we learned this morning, for example, about mirror neurons and about learning and attention and consciousness and that sort of thing. Is there such a thing as half a language or 100th of a language? I've got written here in my notes. And a couple of interesting deviations. An application we discussed at some length involving speech recognition by a robot that in turn redelivers the speech information using gestures in American Sign Language to hearing impaired children, and some of the challenges inherent in that kind of an application. A second very interesting application involving the recognition of humans' voices in unison. For example, chanting behaviors as we see at football games and in religious ceremonies, those sorts of things. And then finally we closed out with some discussions about child speech recognition and why we have difficulties with recognizing the speech of children. No real conclusions arrived at in terms of ethical or business or applicability issues, but just a sort of a general agreement that the technology itself has moved somewhat slowly, but has gone quite a distance but is beginning to sort of slow down in terms of its advancements and some interest in finding alternate approaches to solving the problem. Did that just about summarize it, speech people? Okay.
Okay. With Luciano Fatiga, I animated this discussion about neuro robotics in the wider sense, the relationship between neurophysiology and artificial cognitive systems. I guess by self-selection, those in this group certainly all agreed that that would be something interesting to discuss. So the idea that we can learn from neuroscience at the level of deriving ideas, heuristics, inspiration for creating artificial cognitive systems. I think that was clear. We all agreed on that. I think it was also interesting to see that certainly Luciano was arguing strongly that neuroscience can profit from models being acted out, being ultimately demonstrated on robots, that there's insight into necessary pieces, missing pieces. There can be a real assessment of models by bringing them to a robotic level. Secondly, I had a hard time finding a summary. The second aspect was perhaps that there was a lot of confusion too. I would say we all saw that it is a very interdisciplinary field. I personally tried to justify our confusion by saying that there are different scientific traditions coming from, let's say, biology at one end, very attentive to detail, very description-oriented, and maybe more abstract physics or engineering principles at the other end, and that in this interdisciplinary tension, it's hard ultimately to find a consensus and clarity. So we spent considerable time probably just clarifying each other's language and reacting to misunderstandings and things like that. As here in the plenum, I had proposed this minimum versus maximum kind of model as a gradient along which one could try to clarify these issues. And we did agree that was a useful gradient, I believe. Most of us, at least, I think, agreed. And we discussed different positions along that gradient, how detailed models would relate to neurophysiology, for instance, was a real issue of debate. We even had a brief debate about the Human Brain Project that was perceived as being localized along that gradient, including even a little bit political discussions about it. That was resolved, I hope, in a friendly way. I think another agreement, maybe the last point I want to make, was that addressing these points, about the level of detail, how minimal or maximal your model should be, depends on the goal that you want to achieve with your cognitive robot. That is, there are often very different motivations, different ultimate goals for building artificial cognitive systems, and depending on that goal, you will have a different relationship to neurophysiology. That was certainly a point Luciano always referred back to. We did not discuss, maybe I should also mention that, maybe did not discuss as much as you might think if you know that field a little bit more, about the special role of motor behavior, sensory motor constraints, and perhaps embodiment, as compared to more abstract cognitive approaches. A bit surprising perhaps, and this community is supposedly closer to the embodied perspective. We had a whole conference about that, but that actually did not become so much a topic of discussion. I wonder if that's because we all agree, or perhaps because some of us are not even aware of that debate. But that was not a big topic.
In the last workshop was the one on practical aspects of EU cognition after EUCogIII, so obviously I chaired that one. We discussed a little bit of why we might want to have a network, and then what we would need to do in order to achieve these aims. It seems there was a significant agreement that the interdisciplinarity of the network is a plus and a major focal point for the network, that we should maintain that, as opposed to becoming an association which is focused on some kind of specific slice in the academic areas. And that as a result of that, the more conceptual or fundamental issues are relatively central for the network. On the other hand, people said that the networking itself is a very crucial component of what we've been doing so far, and that should be maintained. So it seems there's a reasonable agreement that we will have some sort of an association, and that this association will provide a framework structure in the form of one event within which several kinds of events can be run. And we discussed about financial aspects of this, how this might run, and legal aspects. And we decided that we need to make some concrete steps in this direction now. So we decided that within the EUCogIII space, which is the rest of this year, we will have a meeting on probably November 29 and 30th with a small focus group of people. And the major thing that we'll do there is write the statutes of the new association, which involves a lot of important decisions, and make some concrete plans on what we're going to do in 2015. So you will be invited for that meeting, which is a working meeting, so it's different from these meetings in that sense. And you'll be obviously posted on the developments that we will have from there. I was happy that we formed a little organization committee for that meeting, so we can decide what we're going to do up front and what kinds of problems we want to solve during that meeting. So it looks like we're on a good track for actually solving a good number of the practical issues within this year. Okay.